The neighborhood of Cedar Ridge was the kind of place that boasted perfectly trimmed hedges, polished SUVs in every driveway, and mailboxes that matched in color and style. It was the sort of suburb where the smell of fresh-cut grass seemed to linger longer than anywhere else, and where neighbors prided themselves on being friendly, at least on the surface. To any outsider, it looked idyllic. But to those who lived there, the cracks were easy to spot if you looked close enough. For the Ramirez family, the neighborhood had started out as a dream. After years of saving, they'd finally purchased a modest home with a spacious yard for their 3 children to run and play. The cul-de-sac seemed perfect, quiet, safe, and welcoming. At least that was what they thought during those first few weeks. Hovering on the other side of the street was Karen Hensley, a woman in her late 50s whose entire personality seemed to revolve around keeping Cedar Ridge up to standard. She wasn't on the HOA board officially, but everyone knew she might as well have been running the place. Her lawn looked like something from a catalog. Her trash bins were lined up at a precise 90-degree angle every pickup day, and her glare could send delivery drivers scrambling back to their trucks. She saw herself as the guardian of the neighborhood, keeping order, maintaining appearances, and watching for any signs of trouble. The Ramirez kids, full of summer energy, quickly became a thorn in her side. They weren't unruly by any normal measure. Riding bikes, chalking the sidewalks, setting up sprinklers in the yard. But Karen viewed every laugh, every squeal, and every ball bouncing near her property line as an act of war. Started small. First, she sent friendly reminders about HOA rules, even though none of them actually applied to the Ramirez family's activities. She slipped notes into their mailbox about maintaining curb appeal and keeping noise levels appropriate for the neighborhood. Then came the glares from across the street whenever the kids played outside after school, her curtains twitching as she monitored every move. At first, the family tried to ignore her. After all, every neighborhood has one person who takes things too seriously. But Karen wasn't content to just glare and write notes. She escalated. When the Ramirez children set up a lemonade stand one sunny afternoon, Karen marched right over, not to buy a cup, but to lecture them about unlicensed street vending. When the kids used chalk to draw hopscotch patterns, she threatened to report them for defacing public property. And when their soccer ball accidentally rolled into her yard, she confiscated it and left it sitting on her porch as a silent warning. It all came to a head on a Tuesday evening in July. The children were playing with water balloons, shrieking and laughing as they dashed back and forth across their lawn. A balloon burst near the sidewalk, not even on Karen's grass, but it was enough to send her into a rage. She stomped back inside, pulled out her phone, and made a call. This wasn't to the HOA. This time, she went straight to the police. Karen reported unsupervised children causing property damage and disturbing the peace, adding false claims to make the situation sound urgent. By the time the Ramirez parents realized what was happening, a patrol car was already pulling into the cul-de-sac. Neighbors peered out from behind blinds, curiosity buzzing like static in the summer air. The officer stepped out, scanning the scene. A quiet street, 3 kids holding half-empty water balloons, and 2 anxious parents trying to understand what was happening. Karen strode across her driveway like a prosecutor approaching the bench, pointing and raising her voice, demanding action. But what Karen didn't know was that this call would be her undoing. The officer's calm gaze shifted from the children to Karen, taking in her aggressive tone, her exaggerated complaints, and the absence of any real crime. The Ramirez family stood silently, bewildered, while the cop began asking Karen pointed questions. This was no longer just about kids playing outside. The officer's expression made it clear something wasn't adding up, and Karen, too blinded by her own self-righteousness, didn't realize she had just crossed a line she couldn't uncross. The neighbors watched closely as the situation grew tense, their carefully maintained suburban peace about to shatter in the most unexpected way. The calm of Cedar Ridge was over, and for Karen Hensley, the storm was only just beginning. The patrol car's engine idled quietly in the cul-de-sac, its flashing lights painting streaks of red and blue across the immaculate driveways of Cedar Ridge. What should have been a trivial neighborhood spat had suddenly taken on the weight of an official investigation. The Ramirez family stood on their front lawn, confused but calm, while Karen Hensley planted herself in the middle of the street like a general marshaling troops. Karen spoke rapidly, waving her arms in sharp, rigid motions as she laid out her case. She described the Ramirez children as wild, destructive, and unsupervised. She claimed their toys had damaged her property, their laughter had shattered the peace of the neighborhood, and their very presence was lowering property values. The officer listened without interruption, but there was a growing impatience behind his steady expression. He wasn't hearing the kind of information that warranted an emergency call. As Karen piled exaggeration on top of exaggeration, neighbors quietly emerged from their homes. They gathered in loose clusters on driveways and sidewalks, some pretending to check mailboxes, others holding cups of coffee as a flimsy excuse to watch the scene unfold. They had all heard Karen's complaints before. They had seen her scribbling notes about trash cans an inch out of place, scolding children for riding bikes too close to her curb. Now, they were curious to see what would happen when her crusade ran headfirst into actual law enforcement. The officer finally shifted his focus to the Ramirez property. The lawn was neat, the sidewalk spotless except for faint chalk drawings, and the only damage in sight was a small water balloon fragment near the curb. The children, still clutching the remnants of their game, stood quietly next to their parents. There was no sign of chaos, no broken windows or trampled flower beds, just the normal mess of a summer evening outside. When questioned, the Ramirez parents explained everything. How Karen had been leaving notes, making complaints, and threatening to involve authorities over trivial matters. They described how their kids were always supervised, how they played only in their yard, and how every accusation Karen had made was either wildly exaggerated or outright false. The officer's eyes narrowed as he turned back to Karen. The shift in his demeanor was subtle but unmistakable. His questions became more direct, pressing her for specific examples, for evidence, for details about the so-called damage. Karen bristled, realizing the tide was turning. Her confident posture wavered as she stammered through her answers, unable to point to anything concrete. Meanwhile, the Ramirez family remained calm and cooperative, offering to show their yard, the toys, even security camera footage from their doorbell cam if needed. Their willingness to be transparent only highlighted Karen's evasiveness. The officer's radio crackled softly as he took notes. What began as a simple neighborhood disturbance call was now veering into something else entirely. False reporting to the police was a serious matter, and this officer wasn't about to let someone waste valuable time and resources just because she didn't like kids playing outside. Karen, still convinced of her own authority, tried to reassert control. She gestured toward the Ramirez home, insisting that the family violated HOA bylaws and that they were a menace to the community. But the officer reminded her firmly that HOA disputes were civil matters, not criminal ones. Law enforcement didn't exist to enforce Karen's personal vision of suburban perfection. At that moment, several neighbors spoke up. One by one, they shared their own stories of Karen's harassment, how she had threatened to report them for minor issues, how she prowled the streets with a clipboard, taking photos of anything she deemed improper. The officer listened, his expression hardening as the pattern became clear. Karen realized too late that she had overplayed her hand. What she thought would be a swift punishment for the Ramirez family was becoming an informal investigation into her own behavior. The officer's tone sharpened as he reminded her of the consequences for filing false police reports. Wasting officers' time was not a game, and he made it clear she could be held accountable. The Ramirez children, still confused but reassured by their parents' calm, retreated into the house as the situation unfolded. Inside, their parents exchanged worried glances. They had tried to avoid conflict, but Karen wasn't just a nosy neighbor anymore. She was a danger. And now, with police attention fixed squarely on her, she was unlikely to back down quietly. After taking statements and gathering details, the officer left with a warning, not to the Ramirez family, but to Karen herself. She stood rigidly in her driveway as the patrol car rolled away, her lips pressed in a thin line. The neighbors slowly dispersed, murmuring to one another about what they'd just witnessed. That night, the the Ramirez family locked their doors with an uneasy feeling. They knew Karen wouldn't take humiliation well. People like her never admitted defeat. They doubled down. What none of them realized was that Karen was already plotting her next move, determined to make the Ramirez family's life miserable. But Karen had drawn too much attention to herself. And now there were official records of her behavior. The police officer who drove away that evening wasn't finished with her yet. The quiet of Cedar Ridge was fractured, and the battle lines were now drawn. The Ramirez family was bracing for retaliation, but they weren't the only ones preparing for what came next. After the patrol car pulled away that evening, Cedar Ridge settled into an uneasy quiet. The Ramirez family hoped the confrontation would mark the end of Karen Hensley's interference. They believed that a warning from law enforcement might finally make her back off. But Karen was not the kind of neighbor who learned lessons. To her, the officer's skepticism wasn't a sign to stop. It was a challenge to find another way to win. The very next morning, the signs of retaliation appeared. A bright orange HOA violation notice was taped to the Ramirez family's front door, citing improper lawn maintenance. Even though their yard looked no different than anyone else's. Within days, more notices followed, claims about unsightly toys left outside, trash bins placed out too early, and cars parked at improper angles. Each complaint was petty, but together they painted a picture Karen intended to present to the HOA board. The Ramirez family as troublemakers unfit for Cedar Ridge. Karen didn't stop with written complaints. She began walking past the Ramirez home several times a day, always with her phone in hand, pretending to document violations. She hovered near the curb when the children played, making notes on a clipboard, sometimes even snapping photos. Her presence was constant, oppressive, and clearly meant to intimidate. The Ramirez parents tried to keep life normal for their children, but the tension was impossible to ignore. Even something as simple as riding bikes around the cul-de-sac became an exercise in caution, with the kids glancing nervously toward Karen's house, wondering what would set her off next. At first, other neighbors stayed silent, unwilling to get involved. Karen had made a reputation for herself as someone who could make life difficult if crossed. But after the police visit, whispers started to circulate. People remembered their own run-ins with her. Notes left on doors, angry confrontations over trivial matters, sudden anonymous complaints that always seemed to trace back to her. Unfazed by growing suspicion, Karen escalated further. She submitted formal reports to the HOA board, demanding that they fine the Ramirez family and even suggesting that they should be evicted for repeated violations. When the board hesitated, pointing out the lack of evidence, Karen became more creative. She doctored photos to make it appear as though the Ramirez home was cluttered with trash, and she edited videos to remove the parts where the children's parents were present, making it look as though they roamed unsupervised. Unfortunately for Karen, her campaign attracted attention in places she didn't expect. The police officer who had visited Cedar Ridge kept her name on file after noting discrepancies in her original complaint. He quietly reached out to the HOA board, reminding them of the false report and warning them to be cautious about taking Karen's accusations at face value. Meanwhile, the Ramirez family began documenting everything. They installed additional security cameras and kept meticulous records of every interaction. When Karen walked past with her phone, they filmed her right back. When she left notes, they photographed them before removing them. The family was no longer just hoping she would stop. They were building a case. The tension reached a peak when Karen took things to a personal level. Late one evening, the Ramirez family discovered that their mailbox had been tampered with. The lock was broken, and several pieces of mail were missing. Although there was no direct proof at first, the timing was suspicious. The incident was reported immediately to the police, and now Karen's name appeared once again in the officer's log. That same week, 2 more neighbors came forward to the HOA with stories of Karen's harassment. One described how she had falsely reported them for running an illegal home business simply because they had frequent package deliveries. Another mentioned that Karen once threatened to call animal control because a dog barked for more than 5 minutes. These accounts, combined with the Ramirez family's evidence, painted a picture of a neighbor who abused authority rather than upheld it. As Karen pushed harder, her credibility crumbled. Instead of rallying the neighborhood against the Ramirez family, she isolated herself. The HOA board, wary of legal consequences, began reviewing her complaints with increasing skepticism. And the police, now with multiple reports involving her, decided to keep a closer watch. But Karen didn't see herself losing ground. In her mind, she was the hero fighting to preserve the standards of Cedar Ridge. The more resistance she faced, the more self-righteous she became. She convinced herself that if she just applied enough pressure, through fines, reports, and intimidation, the Ramirez family would crack and leave. What Karen failed to realize was that every move she made was being carefully documented. Every baseless accusation, every falsified photo, every threatening note, each piece became part of a growing file against her. The Ramirez family was no longer just trying to protect their children from an overbearing neighbor. They were preparing to fight back, and they had allies on the HOA board and in law enforcement who were watching closely. Karen thought she was untouchable, the unofficial ruler of Cedar Ridge. But with each desperate attempt to push the Ramirez family out, she was building the case that would ultimately destroy her credibility and expose her to consequences she never imagined. The stage was set for the confrontation to come. And this time, Karen wouldn't be the one calling the shots. Karen Hensley's campaign against the Ramirez family had reached a fever pitch. What started as a single false police call had escalated into weeks of harassment, fabricated HOA complaints, and increasingly desperate tactics. But Karen's obsession blinded her to the reality unfolding around her. The very people she believed she controlled, the HOA board, her neighbors, even the police, were no longer on her side. The Ramirez family's careful documentation had transformed them from quiet victims into credible witnesses. Every photo Karen snapped was matched by footage from security cameras proving her presence and her intimidation tactics. Every fake violation notice she orchestrated was countered with time-stamped images showing a spotless yard and a well-kept home. The family's meticulous records caught the attention of both the HOA leadership and the police officer who had first responded to Karen's 911 call. Behind the scenes, the HOA board began to grow nervous. If Karen was filing complaints based on false information, the board itself could be liable for acting on them. Several members convened privately to review all reports related to the Ramirez family, comparing them against the evidence presented. What they found was damning. None of the violations held up under scrutiny. Instead, a clear pattern of harassment emerged, one that pointed directly back to Karen. The police officer, already suspicious from his first encounter, opened an informal inquiry. He visited neighbors to gather statements and cross-referenced Karen's previous calls. This wasn't her first time exaggerating claims to law enforcement. Records showed she had reported barking dogs that didn't exist, cars she swore were abandoned but belonged to visitors, and loiterers who turned out to be teenagers waiting for a school bus. Each report was frivolous, and each one eroded her credibility. The turning point came when the officer obtained surveillance footage from the Ramirez family showing Karen tampering with their mailbox. It wasn't clear exactly what she had taken, but the act itself was a federal offense. Suddenly, this wasn't just about petty neighborhood disputes, it was a potential crime. The officer documented everything and prepared to escalate the matter. Karen remained oblivious. Convinced of her own untouchable authority, she doubled down. She stormed into HOA meetings, demanding action against the Ramirez family, waving around doctored photos as if they were undeniable proof. But this time, instead of nodding along, board members pressed her for evidence. They asked for dates, times, and witnesses. They requested original files for her photographs. Karen couldn't provide them. Her bluster faltered as questions piled up, and murmurs of disapproval rippled through the room. Meanwhile, neighbors who had once stayed silent now spoke out openly. Some described how Karen had stalked their driveways with her phone. Others recalled threats she'd made if they didn't move holiday decorations fast enough. The carefully cultivated image of Karen as Cedar Ridge's self-appointed guardian began to crumble in full view. The police investigation gained momentum. Officers discreetly interviewed residents, many of whom were eager to share their experiences. The Ramirez family's evidence became the centerpiece of the case. A timeline showing Karen's pattern of harassment, combined with undeniable proof of her tampering with private property. The officer who had once responded to what seemed like a simple disturbance call now had grounds to recommend formal charges. Word spread quickly through the neighborhood. People who once avoided Karen now crossed the street to keep their distance. Her daily patrols with a clipboard, once intimidating, now looked desperate and absurd. Even her closest allies on the HOA board quietly withdrew their support, fearing they might be implicated if they continued backing her claims. Karen, however, misread the shift entirely. She believed the whispers and cold stares were signs of jealousy, proof that others feared her authority. She continued to press the HOA to fine and evict the Ramirez family, not realizing the board was already coordinating with law enforcement to bring her harassment to an end. The final straw came when Karen filed yet another police report, this time claiming the Ramirez children had vandalized her property. Officers arrived, only to find her driveway pristine. No damage, no evidence of any wrongdoing. This blatant lie solidified what the investigation had already uncovered. Karen's pattern of abuse was deliberate and malicious. The police officer informed the HOA that formal charges were now likely. The board, unwilling to be caught in the fallout, scheduled an emergency meeting to address the situation. Neighbors were invited to speak, and many planned to attend, ready to share their stories publicly. Karen expected the meeting to be her moment of triumph, where the Ramirez family would finally be punished. She didn't realize it would become the stage for her own downfall. As the date of the meeting approached, tension in Cedar Ridge reached its peak. The Ramirez family prepared to present their case, armed with video footage, photographs, and statements from supportive neighbors. The police officer prepared to announce the findings of his investigation. And Karen, oblivious to the trap closing around her, rehearsed her speech demanding the Ramirez family's eviction. The battle was about to move from whispered complaints to a full-blown public reckoning. And this time, Karen wouldn't be in control of the narrative. The night of the emergency HOA meeting arrived with an almost electric tension in the air. Cedar Ridge residents filed into the community center, their voices low, their glances sharp with anticipation. Word had spread quickly. The board was going to address the growing conflict between Karen Hensley and the Ramirez family. Some came to defend, some came to condemn, and many came simply to watch. Karen arrived early, as though she owned the room. She carried a thick folder stuffed with papers and photographs, convinced that this was the night she would force the Ramirez family out of the neighborhood once and for all. In her mind, this meeting was her stage, a chance to solidify her authority, to remind everyone why she considered herself Cedar Ridge's protector. The Ramirez family arrived quietly, without fanfare, accompanied by several neighbors who had grown tired of Karen's behavior. They carried their own file of evidence, time-stamped photos, videos, written statements, all carefully organized to counter every one of Karen's claims. The police officer who had been investigating Karen's harassment was present as well, standing off to the side in uniform, not to take sides but to ensure order and to make his findings known if called upon. The HOA board members took their seats, their expressions grim. They were no longer humoring Karen's crusade. The pattern of complaints had become an embarrassment, and the board's credibility was now at stake. If they were seen as enabling harassment, they could face legal consequences of their own. Karen seized the floor the moment the meeting began. She launched into a tirade about neighborhood standards and unruly children, waving her folder for dramatic effect. She rattled off a list of supposed violations. Trash cans left out overnight, unsightly toys, excessive noise. She even presented edited photos, claiming they proved the Ramirez family was neglecting their property. But this time, instead of nodding along, the room was silent, and then the Ramirez family was invited to respond. They methodically dismantled Karen's accusations one by one. For every photo Karen showed, they had the original footage from their security cameras showing the truth. For every claim about noise or unsupervised children, they had testimony from neighbors who had seen the kids playing under their parents' watchful eyes. The Ramirez presentation was calm, factual, and devastating. The turning point came when the police officer spoke. He confirmed that Karen had made a false report during the original call, exaggerating or fabricating details about the children causing damage. He revealed that her history of frivolous complaints extended far beyond this one family, and that surveillance footage showed her tampering with the Ramirez mailbox, a crime that carried real legal weight. The officer's words carried authority, and the impact was immediate. Gasps rippled through the room as the reality sank in. Karen wasn't a concerned neighbor upholding community values. She was a bully who had crossed legal lines. Neighbors began voicing their own grievances. One described being falsely accused of running a business from home. Another recalled Karen photographing their yard at night. The stories piled up until it became impossible for anyone to deny the pattern. What Karen believed was her strength, her relentless pursuit of control, was now revealed as her downfall. Karen tried to shout over them, insisting that everyone else was lying, that the neighborhood was conspiring against her. But the more she raged, the less convincing she became. Her carefully cultivated image of authority crumbled in front of everyone. The HOA board president finally cut her off, announcing that not only would the Ramirez family face no penalties, but Karen herself would be subject to disciplinary action. The board issued her an official censure and stripped her of any informal authority she had been wielding over HOA matters. The police officer went further. He announced that the investigation into Karen's harassment and mailbox tampering was being referred to the district attorney for possible charges. Karen's face drained of color as the weight of her actions finally hit her. For the first time, she wasn't in control of the narrative. The meeting ended with a sense of closure for the Ramirez family, but also a sense of shock for the entire neighborhood. Karen stormed out, her folder clutched tightly against her chest. But there was no victory in her stride. The power she once held over her neighbors was gone, replaced by suspicion and contempt. The Ramirez family left the meeting relieved but wary. They knew Karen's temper would not vanish overnight, even under the threat of legal consequences. But now they had the full support of their neighbors, the HOA board, and the police. Karen could no longer operate in the shadows, using intimidation and lies to get her way. As the lights in the community center flicked off and residents returned to their homes, there was a feeling that Cedar Ridge had turned a corner. The false authority Karen had clung to for years had finally been exposed for what it really was, a hollow act built on bullying and deception. Yet Karen wasn't finished. Even as she faced the possibility of charges, she was already plotting her next move, convinced that she could somehow turn the tide. What she didn't realize was that every step she took from here on out would only tighten the net closing around her. The neighborhood war had reached its climax, but the final blow was still to come. And this time, Karen wouldn't just face angry neighbors. She'd face the law itself. The next morning, the cul-de-sac felt strangely quiet, as though the air itself was waiting to see what would happen. The night before, Karen's desperate attempt to frame the family had ended in humiliation. The police had left with stern warnings, and neighbors who once avoided conflict now whispered openly about her antics. Yet no one truly knew how far she would go, or how far the authorities would go to deal with her. By sunrise, the family had decided it was time to push back in full force. For weeks they had endured her relentless harassment. Complaints about their kids playing outside, threats to have them evicted, and now false police reports. What Karen hadn't anticipated was that every move she made left a paper trail, and the family had quietly been documenting everything. They compiled a full timeline of her behavior, letters she had slipped under their door, voicemails filled with thinly veiled threats, and footage from their security cameras that showed her trespassing on their property late at night to snap photos. Even her latest stunt with the police call was captured clearly, disproving her lies about the children's supposed criminal behavior. At noon, 2 squad cars pulled up to the cul-de-sac. The neighborhood came alive with the sound of blinds shifting and doors cracking open. Karen stepped outside, wearing a smug expression as if she believed the officers had returned to carry out her eviction request. But her smile faltered when she realized the officers were walking straight toward her, not the family's house. The lead officer spoke firmly as they presented her with a list of citations and a summons for filing false police reports, harassment, and trespassing. The color drained from her face as the consequences finally caught up with her. This wasn't the attention she craved. The officers explained that her calls had wasted valuable emergency resources, and her attempts to weaponize the HOA rules against her neighbors were now under formal investigation. The HOA president, who had kept his distance for fear of Karen's wrath, suddenly appeared at the edge of the driveway. He had been contacted by several board members after word spread about the police visit the previous night. With mounting pressure from the community, he announced that the HOA would be holding a special meeting to review her repeated violations of the association's code of conduct. The family watched all this unfold from their porch, careful not to celebrate too openly. They knew the situation was far from over. Karen was stubborn, and people like her rarely admitted defeat gracefully. But they also knew she had finally lost her shield of authority. The community was no longer afraid of her. The following week, the HOA meeting was packed. Neighbors who had quietly suffered Karen's bullying came forward one by one, sharing their own experiences: harassment over lawn decorations, threats about driveway cracks, demands for children to stay indoors during daylight hours. Every testimony chipped away at the last remnants of her credibility. Karen sat stiffly in her seat, glaring at everyone as if willing them to fall silent. But no one stopped talking. The evidence spoke louder than her scowl. The HOA board unanimously voted to fine her heavily for her violations and to restrict her from holding any future positions of influence within the association. It wasn't an eviction, but it was a public rebuke she couldn't ignore. For the family, this was vindication. Their kids were finally free to play outside without fear of being reported to the police. Neighbors who had once avoided eye contact now waved and chatted in their driveway, grateful someone had finally stood up to Karen. As the weeks passed, Karen became less visible. She still lived on the same street, but her power was gone. She stopped patrolling the neighborhood with her camera phone, stopped banging on doors to issue threats, and stopped calling the police over minor inconveniences. It seemed she had finally learned that intimidation only worked when people allowed it to. The family reinforced their home with a few more security measures, just to be safe, but they no longer felt the same tension every time they heard footsteps on the sidewalk. The children laughed louder, played longer, and even helped other kids on the street feel safe coming out to join them. What had once been a quiet battleground slowly turned back into a community. Months later, a for sale sign appeared on Karen's lawn. Whether she moved by choice or because the mounting fines and constant social pressure drove her out, no one really knew. But when the moving truck finally arrived, the entire street seemed to exhale. It was as if a storm had passed, leaving clear skies and a stronger neighborhood in its wake. The family never sought revenge beyond holding her accountable. They didn't need to gloat or rub in her downfall. Her own actions had been her undoing. The police record, HOA fines, and community backlash had spoken louder than any confrontation ever could. In the end, Karen's downfall became a story everyone on the street remembered. A cautionary tale about what happens when someone abuses power and underestimates the people around them. And for the family, it was proof that standing firm, documenting everything, and trusting the truth to come out could turn even the ugliest battles into victories. With Karen gone, the neighborhood children could play freely again. The cul-de-sac no longer echoed with tension, but with the sounds of laughter, bicycles rolling on pavement, and the occasional grill out where neighbors shared food and stories. What had started as a nightmare ended as a lesson in unity, and a reminder that even the loudest bullies can't drown out the truth forever. The family knew they had done more than just defend themselves. They had changed the dynamic of the entire community. By refusing to bow to intimidation, they showed everyone that one determined voice could break the hold of fear and restore balance. And as they watched the last moving truck pull away, they couldn't help but smile. Not because Karen had lost, but because their kids had won back the simple joy of being kids. 10.